you were in the middle telling people that you are a marriage therapist, you're an intuitive coach.
Yeah.
And what I want to ask is, do you encounter a lot of people who experience codependency in your space?
Absolutely, 110%. I think that codependency shows up in like so many different ways, but it's like the bottom line of it is that it's still codependency. So, you know, that over giving in the relationship, that self-sacrificing to the point where like you're suppressing your needs, you don't really even recognize who you are anymore. They're all forms of codependency. And I actually couldn't wait to hop on this call with you because I know we had a conversation about, you know, this previously, but when I was actually reading into the history of codependency, the original term for it was co-alcoholic, because you see it a lot of times in people that are dealing with substance abuse and stuff, and like family and friends who come in and like enable them. So it originally came from that term co-alcoholic because it's like that person that's enabling is a participant in the addiction.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, that actually, in you just saying that, you have given me an opportunity to bring up what I think is a really good definition with it. So first and foremost, then on those lines, would you agree that codependency is to some degree an addictive tendency from one and both parties, right? One party, the strong desire to be able to give and to be seen as someone who's constantly giving, and the other one to be taking all the time. Someone who needs someone to enable them, someone who depends on someone to show up for them perpetually and constantly and like provide for them, etc., and unconsciously uses them. Right. So we could see that it's two people who basically are in an unconscious version of an addiction, right?
Right.
So one of the things around codependency, and what I'd like to describe it as, or a definition of codependency, is it's two people in their own unconscious coping mechanisms, not aware that those two coping mechanisms really just enable each other. And the reason why I say coping mechanisms is because a lot of people beat themselves up about codependency, and they beat themselves up about being in those relationships. Alcoholism in itself, sex addiction, drugs, any of those addictions are just coping mechanisms. They're a method to deal with a wound, because no one has really taught us a healthy, constructive method to be able to work with coping with the wound. Right. So the ego develops like a method of like, you know, trying to chase someone for love, or trying to be seen as someone who's absolutely, you know, providing, someone who never wants to upset someone who always wants to enable, as we just talked about.
Right.
And so what it really is just people's coping mechanisms. And why I think that, you know, I like that definition is because when it creates awareness, and when people can see their coping mechanisms, then that doesn't just mean that I'm doomed to have this kind of relationship. It just means that this is me unconsciously getting triggered by my fear of being left alone, my fear of not having love, etc. Would you agree with that?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that the root of codependency on both ends, whether you're the person that's over reliant on the other person to get your needs met, or whether you're the person that's sacrificing your needs and over giving, both of them, it's rooted in that fear of abandonment. You know, like I'm willing to do whatever. I'm willing to sacrifice whatever and give whatever it is I need to give to maintain that love and to maintain that connection with you. And I think that's where it's kind of like this new version of codependency, because kind of like how I just did that split of like, there's that person that can be like the over giver, and then that person of being like the over reliant of like, I'm going to get into this relationship with you and you're going to meet every single last one of my needs, you know, like they're both equally unhealthy. So the root of it, I definitely think, is that fear of abandonment, that fear of rejection. And it really comes from just our conditioning, like you were mentioning before. It comes from our conditioning, and kind of like this mindset of, I'm not good enough unless I'm doing for you. I'm not worth anything unless I'm like performing in this relationship. And a lot of the times we don't even notice that we're doing it because we've had to most likely do it with our parents.
I want to ask you, what is one of the strongest ways you've seen codependency show up in your workplace? So you said, we've talked about how it shows up in different ways. What is maybe one strong story that you see with codependency in your work?
So last night I was actually working with a couple And she came in and she was saying like, oh, all the things that like my husband used to do, he's not doing for me anymore. And like, in order for this relationship to work, I need for him to show up in this way, or else I don't know like what's going to happen. So we talked a little bit about like, okay, what is happening in the relationship? How are you both showing up and showing love? And like, you know, her husband has gone through like certain things. So like who he used to be when they were dating, like, you know, in their early 20s is not the person that he really is anymore. The love hasn't changed in the relationship. However, just the way that they are able to show up for each other and show that love just looks a little bit different. But she's still expecting him to be the person that he was in his 20s. And that's not who he is anymore. So I think that's
She's
kind of
probably
like an
not the same
example.
either.
Absolutely. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So I think like an example of that, like in that relationship is kind of just like, I'm expecting you to do X, Y, and Z. Like she literally has a list of like what it is that he needs to do in order for her to feel loved in the relationship, rather than kind of getting to this point of like, okay, this is who you're showing me to be. This is the love that you're able to give me at this point. And it kind of, it's like she's not really allowing it to kind of like shift back on her in terms of like, can I handle this or not? Like, is this enough for me or not? A lot of the times when we're codependent, we're so focused on changing the other person, and we're so focused on that they need to be this person for me. And it's so unhealthy because you're not really, what you're energetically like showing them is that you're not really loving them from the space that they're in. You're not even really to come to this acceptance of it. And you don't even have to. She doesn't have to accept that if she doesn't want to. She has a choice. But it's like just that underlying belief. I think that's kind of what's keeping the relationship in this dynamic. And I told both of them, I said, you know, I love that you guys are here in couples therapy, but I think individual therapy could be really helpful.
Yeah. I actually think, you know, on that topic, for me, the reason why I stray away from working with couples is because I feel like couples were individuals before they were a couple.
Right.
And each individual has had so much of their own childhood conditioning and their trauma that they bring to the table in a relationship, which when you're now trying to work together, your ego is definitely going to be like, listen, my trauma is worse than yours. I need to be heard more than you. You don't listen to me enough. And so at that point, these are two individuals who have not had or gone through any work before, who are not going to let the collective grow at that particular space unless they both want to individually.
Right.
Because they're unconsciously competing. Their egos at this point are like, you know, you're bringing this to the table and you're making me seem this way, or the relationship go this way, etc. Which brings me to a point of where I've seen codependency show up really strongly or in a pattern is two things. One, massive internalization, where one individual will take everything that the other partner is doing to mean something about them.
Right.
And so, as you said very rightly, therefore, only if that other person changes, only if that other partner does things a certain way, or only if that other partner gives them the love in the way they think it has to be given, or in the way only they assume that it has to be given. And a lot of that has to do with like Disney conditioning, has to do with conditioning of like romance, like an idea of romance that we think we have, cultural conditioning, etc. But when that isn't met, this one individual internalizes so strongly that they start to think that the relationship is defunct. And I think that's what gets them to overperform. That's what gets them to overcompensate. That's what then gets them to step into this place saying, okay, I have to basically do this, this, and this, and this, because otherwise I'm not lovable enough. I'm not valuable enough. You know, my partner is not meeting my needs, which makes me feel like I've got something wrong with me. So I need to overcompensate, I need to make my partner feel X, Y, Z, etc. But another way, which I think people don't realize shows up as codependency, and this might be really challenging for a lot of folks listening, but I'd love for you to keep your ears slightly tweaked to this. A big way that I've noticed codependency show up is between the narcissist and the victim. And this one is difficult to talk about because of the sensitivities to either narcissism or to victimization or victimhood. But I keep telling people this. A victim cannot exist without a narcissist, and the narcissist cannot exist without a victim.
Right.
Because the narcissist thrives upon the manipulation of people who the individual knows they can like mold to get what they need, which is their own validation, etc. Now, simultaneously, a lot of us who've been in relationships with narcissists we feel alive when we're around the narcissist because we feel like we're of some use.
Right.
We want to be like completely molded and shaped and like, you know, unconsciously bashed in and out just so we feel relevant enough to the narcissist and we can receive that love. It's only when it gets to a point that the pain is high enough that we're like, oh my God, I can't believe that individual did that to me.
Right.
But unconsciously, we were surrendering to that individual for so long. And that, in its essence, is codependency.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you guys still hear me good? I just want to make sure before I talk. Perfect. Because I just set the
I can hear you perfect.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I set the iPad on top of something, so I just wanted to make sure. But yeah, so it's like, it's this idea of like having to work for love, like having to work like really, really, really hard for love. And like my sense of self-worth is in how much you choose me. My sense of self-worth is in how much you can show me that I'm of use, literally, like you said. And I think the thing that's like, I know when I was in this relationship dynamic very long time ago, it was that fear of abandonment, just literally, it was just like running rampant in the relationship. That fear of like not feeling good enough if I wasn't doing, if I wasn't giving, you know, and that's just not a good place to be. It's not a good place to be in because you're placing so much of like your everything into this relationship. And that's the thing about like the codependent and the narcissist relationship. It's like the narcissist, they're both insecure, like in their attachment styles. They both have experienced some type of attachment trauma. But then the thing is that they're just coping with it in different ways. So one person's like, okay, I'm going to take because it's every man for himself. And the codependent is like, okay, well, I need to give and self-sacrifice to the point where I need this relationship to give me that validation, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens with, like if you are a person who is codependent, you're internalizing everything that happens in the relationship about you. My partner didn't text me back. That means they're cheating on me. My partner did this. This means that, you know?
Yeah.
It's that hyper, like, I can almost call it like this hyper attunement, but like a negative attunement to your partner.
Like a vigilance, like a hyper vigilance.
Right.
Always scanning yourself for fear, right? Always scanning your surrounding for when things will go bad. Because that's your unconscious belief is that you don't deserve them to go well.
Right. Right, exactly. So I think that's what's so painful about the relationship, like with the narcissist. And with all of this, you know, I always, being somebody who has healed from this myself, it's going to take a lot of compassion that you have to give to yourself, because that's really kind of like the basis of what we're starting to bring up in this conversation now is really kind of like the shadow aspects of like this codependent, you know, like we think we're helping and we think that we know what's best for this person and we want to give and we want to give and we want to give, but it's unhealthy helping. Like it's not allowing them to be who they need to be.
I love the term that you brought up, unhealthy helping. I've never heard that before, but I really enjoy it. And codependency can also exist, for those of you who are listening, can also exist in relationships with your family, not just with your partner. They can exist in friendships. A lot of the time when we feel like we're only of worth to a friend circle when we're, you know, showing up in a certain way or we're providing certain guidance. And like you said, it is the fear of self-abandonment, a fear of abandonment that actually leads to continuous self-abandonment.
Right.
So we're basically now at this point manifesting our own fear because nothing along the way has changed our belief. And one thing I'd like to bring on is like statistically, I believe the ratio of, you know, how people show up gender-wise in terms of codependency is it's a larger portion of women who tend to show up as the codependent in that space where they have been conditioned culturally through generations to say, I must be of service to someone to feel some sense of self-worth.
Right.
So now when you have your parents or family or like, you know, you have generations telling you that as a woman that you can only be valid if you're doing this to someone, you unconsciously will attract a partner, whether it's a man or someone else, you'll attract someone who will unconsciously use you so that you feel like, okay, I am now serving them. I am living this generational dream, which is unconsciously generational trauma. It's like the collective shadow, as you've talked about, that we're living in.
Right, right, absolutely. And I think that's why it's kind of like being able to figure out like who it is that you are outside of giving, who it is that you are outside of just always constantly being like of service to someone, to the point where like you just, you know, it's all about them and it's not about you, you know? And I think it, like, even kind of like how you mentioned, it happens to a lot of us like on this subconscious level. subconsciously we're not even like checking in to see like, okay, like what is my intention behind this sacrificing that I'm doing right now? Like, is this unhealthy helping, or like, is this healthy helping? A lot of us think that we're helping and we're not helping people. A lot of us think that like we're loving from this place of authenticity and we're sacrificing so much, but it's really because of what it means about us in doing it. It doesn't have anything to do with the other person and us being there for them. It has to do with like how it makes us feel, you know? So I think with like the significant part about all of this is like with a codependent, like if you've been the type of person that has maybe taken like one of those archetype tests or something like that, usually codependents will show up as the caretaker, like as the caretaker, because that's how they show up in the relationship and that's where they get their sense of self-worth. And I think what also ends up happening, and this could even be outside of just, this could be past like romantic relationships, it can happen with family too, is that like codependents usually tend to like take on other people's issues and then blame themselves when it doesn't turn out the way that they wanted it to turn out. So it's just like this cycle of you just keep going, keep ruminating it, because it all goes back to that fear of abandonment.
Right. And I think the fear of the abandonment very strongly creates this belief, right? So when we don't have that space of love or someone who's there to validate, take care of us, or nurture us, the child now perceives themselves, especially when they're younger, as not being worthy of that love.
Right.
So therefore, to be worthy of that love, they must perform, they must serve, they must, you know, step into a place where, you know, they find themselves valuable enough to be recognized.
Right.
But what it does is, and I was telling someone today as well, that any actions, behaviors, patterns, everything are all a manifestation of a belief. So, you know, as much as you want to change these actions and, you know, manifestations, you can't change them on a continuous basis unless you actually change the belief.
Right.
So then the biggest question is, what the fuck is the belief that's manifesting it?
Right.
And the biggest belief is simply that I am not worthy enough just as I am. I am not lovable enough just as I am. And that comes from the place that if I was, people would have actually fucking showed up for me, but they didn't.
Right.
So who I am just by myself is not worthy or not lovable enough. And I think that's the key aspect, which a lot of people have asked, I know, in the questions like, how do you change it? How do you change it? We'll get to the healing aspect. Yeah. That is something big. That's the biggest aspect that needs to be targeted, is saying, how do I change how I look at myself? Not even what the fuck is my partner doing in this relationship. Your partner is just a reflection of how you show up.
Right.
Your partner is just a reflection of what you've attracted, what you brought into your life, what you think of yourself, and what you find interesting, all of those things. And so the first and the most important thing is, what is the evaluation of myself? Like, where do I come from in this? Like, what am I actually hurting from before I question what is my partner bringing to the table? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, 110%. You have to do, I saw someone in the comments a few minutes ago put something about like shadow work. And that's really kind of like the basis of our conversation and what we're talking about, these shadow aspects of codependency, kind of like the reasons behind why you're doing this. It's not because I mean, I'm pretty sure you guys are beautiful people, but it's not because you're this amazing person and you want to come in and just save the day. It has a lot to do with like, in this giving, how does it make you feel? I always like to say codependency in terms of like, how you feel about me is how I feel about me. So like, if you're unhappy with me, then I'm unhappy with me. If you don't love me, then I don't love me. It's kind of like that you're matching their energy kind of in the way, in the relationship. So I think that's definitely the first thing. And I think in terms of, did you want to kind of go into healing from it, or did you kind of want to talk about it a little bit more?
We can, if you have something to add around it, we can add. I had one pattern that I noticed with codependence that I wanted to bring up before we jumped into healing. But I want you to finish your thought of like, what were you saying?
Yeah. So pretty much that was it. It's just like, how you feel about me is how I feel about myself.
Right.
And I think that's the thing that's really difficult in codependent relationships, because in both people, whether you're with a narcissist or whoever, you both don't really have a core sense of self. Who you are outside of giving to someone, who you are outside of just being somebody's savior and their rescuer and their answer. There's nothing outside of that. And that's because society has conditioned us to be these selfless people. You guys want to see something? A few years ago, before I did my own inner work, I literally got this tattooed on me. So maybe I should switch it.
Oh, it says selfless.
Yeah, so that's a sneak peek of how codependent I was, to the point where I believed that, like, me being so giving and so selfless in relationships was me doing the good thing. It was me being this good person, and because I loved you so much, this is what I'm doing. But it turned into unhealthy helping. And I got into relationships with a lot of people who, like, on a karmic level, this is a little bit different, but I think on a karmic level, they were trying to teach me how to love myself, how to get all that giving I was doing to them, to myself.
You know, one interesting thing, as you were bringing that up, I was thinking to myself, like, people do ask at that point then, and they've asked me before, then how do I know, Yats, when being or showing up for someone is good, and how do I know when it's not good, right? How do I define, like, you know, serving and showing up for community, humanity, etc., and how do I also recognize where I need to be showing up for myself? Because, you know, we've, through various levels of conditioning, through family, through, like, you know, religious conditioning, we've come to believe that selflessness is the best way of existence, right? And so, like, you know, that's ultimately the path to heaven, and whatever else is just to show up for other people. And a good way I like to reflect this back to other people is I say, take a little bit of time just to yourself. So isolate yourself from the people you're getting validation from, or from that you're helping. So isolate yourself from, like, a community, a partner, whatever, even if it's just for a day. When you're sitting with yourself in that day, think about everything that you've done to serve everybody else. And now ask yourself, how am I feeling in this moment?
Right.
How is my body feeling in this moment? Is my body feeling fatigued? Is it feeling overworked? Is it feeling spent? How am I feeling in this moment? Am I feeling anxious that I'm not with those people right now? Which means that I'm only feeling alive when I'm serving them. How am I feeling about who I am right now in this moment? And if you feel like I am nobody because I'm not really helping other people or doing things, then all of these things are telling you that you're addicted to the value of, you know, or your coping mechanism really is getting that level of massive validation from people, to a point where you'll step into unconsciously abandoning yourself just so that you can be there for someone else.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And one pattern I wanted to bring up, actually, I was writing a post which is going to go out after this this live anyway, but it's how to recognize, and this could be really helpful for a lot of you who are trying to recognize, am I in a pattern of codependency? And codependency is often interspersed with self-sabotage. I mean, we've already talked about how, you know, abandoning yourself for someone else and somebody else's purpose is already some degree of, like, self-sabotage. But here's how I've noticed relationships, when people haven't prioritized healing, how their codependent relationships take a pattern. So they get into the codependent relationship. You have this person who's constantly willing to be the giver, the provider, the nurturer, the carer, the, you know, the person who's valued only when the other person does better, right? In all of those cases of giver, provider, nurturer, carer, their jobs will be invalid if there was someone, if no one was there to care, nurture, support, and provide for.
Right.
So already this person is now saying, my identity comes from how I do something for someone else.
Right.
Now, oh, is it back? Yes, good. Okay. Oftentimes, this relationship will continue until the codependency, for whatever reason, becomes painful enough that it ends, because codependency is not designed as a relationship to be sustainable. But when it ends, this is what's really interesting that I've noticed with a lot of codependents. Sometimes they will attract a partner into their lives who wants to show up for them, who wants to be able to support them, who wants to nurture them, who wants to be able to, like, see them. So in essence, a partner who's probably or possibly a little more secure. But these codependents are so unused to getting that level of love. They're so unused to getting that level of recognition, support. They're only used to giving it. Their unconscious belief is that I'm just not worthy enough to receive.
Right.
I can only provide when I give. So much so that when they attract that person into their life who's willing to give it to them, they just cannot receive. And so they'll find, their egos tend to find that person unattractive, find them too needy, and more than anything, to find them suspicious. Right. To be like, I wonder what their intention is. Why is this person giving me so much love? Why is this person trying to show up for me? This is weird. I wonder what their intention is. What is, you know, what are they looking for here? What do they want from me? Right. And that's how they'll push that relationship away to end it, and unconsciously sabotage it, cut that out, so that then they can go back to a codependent relationship where their ego feels at home in the usual pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to bring that up
Absolutely.
because a lot of people may not actually have been aware that they sit in that cycle of doing it. And that cycle
Mm-hmm.
involves us needing to break it based on, healing that we'll talk about in a second.
Yeah, absolutely. You literally just said the story of my life pretty much just now, because that's exactly like that pattern that I was in too for myself, and I think it can be, you're not recognizing it, because I made a post about this the other day that talked a little bit about like, people think that like healthy relationships are boring and stuff like that, and that's because that emotional chaos and like that working for love is not present in healthy relationships. You literally just show up and you are yourself, and that's enough in those types of relationships. So then we say things like, I didn't feel the chemistry. I just didn't feel a spark. Like I didn't know that chemistry that you're feeling is trauma. Like that's not really, that butterflies in your stomach, that's not a good thing. We need to kind of erase that from our heads. It's just triggering a lot of our subconscious wounds that we have that we just haven't faced. So even going back to what it was that you were saying before about having to distance yourself, go through that healing process alone in solitude. Once you can take that time to really do that, you're going to open your mind to actually hearing. You're going to open your mind to actually hearing all of the messages that you need to receive and being able to become a witness to yourself. I think that's what's really important. I think when you take that time to really distance, you figure out what your capacity is. A lot of us don't have a threshold. We're just giving, we're just conforming, but like, we don't have that meter that says, after this point, I'm not giving no more,
Right.
So I think that it's super, super, super important. So I love that you even brought that aspect of it up as well.
Yeah. And I find that what's interesting, as you talked about, is the separation from the coping mechanism shows us how big the coping mechanism is in our life.
Right.
And so that's why, sitting with the self becomes so important, because you start to reflect within as to how attached am I really to this sense of like validation, recognition, approval, guidance, or whatever that I'm getting from the outside. How attached am I to being needed by someone?
Right.
And so for those of you who are like, how do I know if I'm in a codependent relationship, or how do I know if it's bad for me? How do I know if showing up for someone is bad? Because, being good for other people is a good thing. This is the best way, I think, to recognize it, is to actually look within yourself and say, but is it good for you?
Right.
You actually feeling the good, and not just feeling it from your ego, trying to say, yeah, I'm feeling good because people are sending me letters and saying I'm great, or like my partner says, I'm so selfless. But to actually sit and look at, what is your body going through? Does your body feel nourished? Does your body feel like it's receiving? Do you feel like you're getting love? Do you feel like you have love within you?
Right.
Do you feel drained, fatigued? All of those things are such a good way to evaluate, am I actually in this place where I'm giving and receiving, or am I just in a place where it's a dominant sign of like one or the other?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It goes back to that capacity that we talked about. Like, what is your threshold? If you've been in this relationship with this person and it's mirroring the lack of love that you've been able to give to yourself, you need that time in solitude to figure out how you're going to be able to show up in any relationship. It doesn't even have to be romantic, because the codependency, I know for me, it didn't just show up in my romantic relationships. It showed up on my job, people pleasing, staying there after hours because I want to be looked at this like a good employee and stuff like that. And it was not healthy. It was not healthy. And all it does is it kind of just, it boils over. You suppress your needs so much, they don't just get up and like, all right, well, let's go somewhere else. Let's go to a different person. They stay there. And it gets to that point where a lot of people have to kind of like hit that rock bottom, or like they have to go through something that's really, really traumatic for them to start to look at themselves. I can't tell you guys what I want for you, because you have to want something for yourself. But I know that was probably one of the hardest things, that I wasn't really able to, I was ignoring the red flags, I was ignoring the signs, and it took me getting really, really, really hurt in that relationship for me to say, all right, I got some work to do. It can't be these other people. It has to be me.
And since we're on that topic, oh, my bottle of water is here. I was wondering what it was. But since we're on that topic, then, I want to move a little more into the healing, because I think what you're talking about is like, what actually triggered you to get into the healing. And oftentimes it's exactly that when something is not, I tell people it's like this, that the universe gives us, when we're not in a place that's actually authentic or suiting us, the universe gives us reminders, like little bit, like, you know, shocks, little reminders to say like, hey, this is not good for you. Hey, this is not good for you. And those are like the red flags that we don't see, right? They actually show up in our lives, but because we just are not ready to like learn the lesson, to move on, to change, to actually want to change, we're like, no, universe, like, that's not the red flag I want. Give me a bigger red flag. And like push it across, right? Give me a redder flag, universe. This ain't working out for me.
Right.
And so as we go through it, the universe is still trying to tell us like, yo, this is not good for you. And so it's kind of like someone knocking on your door. And they knock on your door and they knock on your door. If you keep ignoring them, they're going to fucking kick your door in and say, yo, I've been waiting outside here for like half an hour for you to get into this. So the universe, just like that, gives us something shocking enough to say, yo, you need some fucking change in your life right now.
Right.
And I do think that is an essential part of the human experience because it does two things. One, even though we hit rock bottom, it allows us to recognize, okay, something needs to fucking change around this place. You know, I need to actually move up and like do something and move forward. Second, it allows us to be compassionate. It allows us to be compassionate because we get to a point where we're hurting so much that we're like, wow, this really messed me up.
Right.
This really hurt me. I'm wounded. This thing really got me. Because otherwise, we have this false sense of feeling tough, right? We're like, yeah, I don't fucking red flags. I don't have red flags. My relationship's perfect. I'm not codependent. He just really loves me. She just really shows up for me in this way. Like, that doesn't really matter until you get to a point where, like we talked about, where the pain is motivating enough that where we say, I need the change, and I can be compassionate for myself in the ways that I did not show up because I didn't even know.
Right.
I didn't know better.
Absolutely.
But now I do. So, you know, Imani, what would you recommend in your, you know, I think both of us, even though we're in the same field, we have different ways of reaching out for people to like to work through their healing. And so I'd love to ask you, what is something that you would recommend to the community? Because so many people out here to offer, you know, in terms of the healing.
Yeah. So I know for me, like how I work with my clients is really before we can get into setting boundaries and like doing all that stuff, you need to figure out who you are first. That's what you need to do. And that's why I love that you talked about having that space. Like I like to call it a little bit like a grieving process, like just that space of like figuring out who you are. Take that time to identify what your values are. Take that time to really reflect on how have I been trying to get my needs met through other people? What has been this thing that like I haven't been able to give to myself, you know? So I like to do it's a whole bunch of shadow work. It's a whole bunch of doing a lot of like inner work first to really identify like who you are as a person overall, outside of giving, outside of being a performer, outside of being a fixer and a rescuer. Who are you? What are the traits that you possess that make you you? And that's the thing that's what I realized that was the beauty in my healing in this is like, wow, I'm unique. There's no one that's able to show up in a relationship the way that I am, not because of all of this giving, but literally who I am at my core.
Right.
Like that, and that literally being it. And once I took that time and I was journaling about it and I was, you know, spending a lot of solitude, time in solitude for that, I was able to realize that. A lot of the times what happens is that we break up with this person, we get rid of the relationship, and then we end up in another relationship that looks the same way. It's like, if you don't spend that time in solitude, you're not going to see those patterns that you're playing into. You're not going to be able to see that. So I think first and foremost is spending that solitude, is spending that time within yourself for you to figure out who am I at my core.
Right. That was beautiful. Thank you, Imani. And I think like, you know, especially when around that period of solitude, right, it really is about investigating how am I showing up?
Right.
You know, when I'm separating from my coping mechanism, who am I now? Like, you know, am I actually grounded, happy, and peaceful? Or am I like itching to go back to that situation where I was in before? And so for us in our work, you know, in our space, when we take people through, especially around codependency, I mean, you know the work that we do, and we do a lot of reparenting. So for me, I focus on how reparenting can actually get people to recognize why they even show up in the way that they're showing up. So for example, for codependents, especially, you know, in a way that they need to people please, in a way they need to, you know, be the nurturer, provider, supporter. I ask them, you know, and we take them through like a process of like deep meditation stuff to go back to that child, to go back to that little version of you, and to recognize when was the first time that you actually really had to prove yourself for love?
Right.
When was the first time that you really had to support someone to actually, for them to say, oh, here you are, now I see you? When was the first time that you had to sacrifice yourself for someone else for them to actually say, hey, now I know you're here, now I want you in my life?
Right.
And I think going back to those times and to reprogram that little child who actually unconsciously and like, you know, lives inside us, who basically works on our subconscious, to reprogram that child and to instead of visualizing the scenario that did happen, to visualize us seeing that child in that moment who's trying to prove themselves and say, hey, you don't need to prove yourself to anyone.
Right.
You don't need to prove yourself you don't need to do this to get love. You don't need to show up in this way. To just soothe them and say, you are lovable just as you are. You are beautiful just as you are. You're such a sweet little being that lives inside me. And to show this to you, not only am I going to visit you here through these meditations, through these moments and soothe you, but in my present moment, I am going to validate you. I am going to celebrate you just as you are. And I think this goes so much hand in hand in what you talked about, because we never, and this is so interesting, I was telling my students today, we never celebrate ourselves just as ourselves.
Right.
We always celebrate ourselves when we're in a relationship, when we're in a family, when we're in an association. We never celebrate ourselves just as ourselves. So, you know, it's funny, it goes down to the simple things, which is that if I were to go out, you know, to a restaurant or go out to get a drink, I'd be like, hey, bartender, can you give me the cheapest gin that you've got? You know, and I'm good with that. But when I go out on a date or when I'm going out with someone else, I'm like, bottle of your finest wine, please. And, you know, it's this unconscious thing of making sure we make everybody else around us feel comfortable. You know, eating food that may not be the best for us, but when we're cooking for other people. I've met so many people who say, I hate cooking for myself, but I like cooking for other people. When other people are around. You know, and it's this unconscious programming. We don't realize it's these subtle things that say, I'd rather do for you than I do for me. So in the present moment, creating that new conditioning to say, how can I show up for myself? How can I commit to myself? So making a list of perhaps healthy or even self-supportive tasks like waking up on time. People don't realize that, you know, a discipline around a routine or like healthy habit is actually self-love. And they think that, oh my God, this is just like, you know, structure. And so here comes the anarchy and I'm just gonna like, you know, fight the structure forever. But they don't realize that it's an unconscious way of like self-sabotage, not keeping to the routine, not keeping to a healthy like establishment of what we like doing, not celebrating the self. So I think, you know, we're both saying the same magical thing, which is that it comes down to worshiping the individual and the self before worshiping the collective. Right?
Yeah. And I love that you put it in that sense, because I do a lot of reparenting with my clients too. And it's like a work in progress, you know, and I just love even seeing how the language changes, because I think that's also a big thing. Because a lot of the times we get out of these types of relationships and it's like, how did I not see the signs? I'm so stupid. I'm so dumb. Everybody was telling me. And it's like that within itself is also the thing that's holding you back in this. Because you're not showing yourself that compassion, because you're not showing yourself that understanding, you're bringing all of this shame and this guilt and this blame into this process. And that's why I think reparenting is so super important, like you said, because a lot of the times we're chastising ourselves in the way that our parents used to chastise us when we did something bad, or when we did something wrong, you know? So even just like those little things, like having that discipline, being able to go in and give yourself that validation. And then also, I think for the most part, like really allowing yourself to forgive yourself too. I think that's a big thing as well, because a lot of the times we're doing all this comparing. Oh, okay, well, this person left me for this person, and that's why things turned out like this. And this person told me to leave this relationship before, and that's why it turned out like this. And it's like, until you can get to a place where you're able to forgive yourself for all the things that you were doing in that survival mode, the longer you're going to be in this space, the longer you're going to use that space to become a victim to all of this, and then end up getting into a relationship, the same exact relationship.
Right. And, you know, that's another thing I tell people is that coming to where we are today if we want to move forward, we actually can't move backwards simultaneously while moving forward, right? And so what we need to do and recognize, you know, not moving backwards is to say, the times that I was back there, the times that I did come from that space, those were times that I did the best with what I knew. Literally. Right. Every single second, every minute, every day, we know more than we did previously because of just the principle of time and evolution, right? And so when we hold ourselves, you know, today, when we're holding ourselves, our past selves to a standard that we hold ourselves to today, of course there's so much judgment, so much criticism, so much shame. Because today we're holding our past selves to what we know now, and we're like, I should have done better back then. I should have done it differently. But you did what you knew best with what you have. There's a reason we call them survival programs, because they were built initially in an attempt to survive. You know, there's a reason they call them attachments, is because they were built initially to attach something to get some love. It is just in not knowing, not understanding how to let go of those things. That's actually what causing us, like, you know, pain and strife. And it's not the fact that, you know, we're actually stepping into more and more manipulative ways. It's just that we don't know how to let go of certain things that in a weird way are prehistoric. It's like driving around a really, 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 really old car that's, you know, kind of polluting the atmosphere and expecting to go at like 180 degrees, 180 miles an hour. You know, you have to be able to let go of that car, accept who you are, what you need, and upgrade yourself through inner work into a new car. So you can drive at that speed, you know, finally, but not judge yourself for like going at 60 miles an hour in an old car and say like, I wish I went at 180. So.
Yeah. And I think that's how you just, you really prevent yourself from doing like that, what can you call like a 180, just like back in the same relationship. And the lessons just keep getting harder and harder and harder and harder. And that was the biggest thing for me. It was just like, wow, I thought that life was happening to me. I thought that these people were doing these things to me, and I was just the victim to all of this. But it's like, I actually was the person that was just co-creating the relationship. I was getting into a relationship with makers because I'm the giver, and that's just, it's like the perfect match, you know? So I think also in regards to healing, that's when, once you can kind of like do that reparenting and you can kind of really figure out who you are at your core and what it is that you need, then you go in and you set the boundaries.
Exactly.
You know, like I don't think that you can do the boundary work before figuring out who it is that you are. So the boundary work comes after that. And it's also, and it's a lot of what I think a lot of people don't talk about, it's setting boundaries with yourself. Like it's not about, no, you can't do this to me, and no. It's not about kind of like drawing the line everywhere. It's about figuring out, okay, what is it that defines me? What am I able to tolerate in the relationship? What's the capacity that I'm able to show up? What am I not tolerating in the relationship, you know? So boundaries, simply all they do is they just define you. They just define you from another person. I may like kiwi, you may like apples, boundary.
Right. And, you know, one of the definitions I really like about boundaries, which I use a lot to teach people, is that boundaries are not actually used to keep what's dangerous outside or to keep other people away outside. It's to keep what's valuable within. And so therefore, if you don't know what's valuable, you don't know how to draw a boundary. You can attempt your whole life to keep everything outside, but you don't know what you're protecting. You don't know, you just think you're protecting it against something, but what are you really protecting? You know, and so I think the establishment of like that understanding of who am I is a natural, you know, it's a natural ability to draw a boundary. You don't even need to draw a boundary when you fully understand who you are, because then you unconsciously separate from the things that no longer serve you, the things that don't align with who you are.
Yeah.
And so
boundaries are important. Yeah.
The last piece that I want to talk about before we head off is compassion. And so I want to ask you, if there was a way that you could offer, you know, everybody watching here, a method to get in or to feel more compassionate about themselves, where they came from or what they were going through, what would you say or do or offer them?
Yeah. So I think my answer is pretty similar to what it is that you were talking about, of like kind of going back to that inner child, like that part of you that maybe wanted some type of like validation or approval from your parents, and you had to do like all of this performing and stuff. So I know with my clients, one of the things I'll do is like, if I have a client that maybe has like a young child or something like that, like, you know, kind of like visualize that you're talking to like a child or like someone that you really care about that's very young, like how would you show them compassion? The way that you're speaking to yourself right now, would you speak to a friend or a family member or a loved one in that way? You know? So kind of like reflecting it back on yourself, it's like, no, I actually wouldn't say that. So it's like finding ways to just be a little bit more softer, being a little bit more gentle. And that also goes back to our childhoods, because maybe some of us didn't grow up in homes where our parents modeled that, where they modeled compassion, where they modeled that patience and that understanding. So that's why that time in solitude is really important, because you're really doing a whole bunch of unlearning and a whole bunch of relearning. It's really bringing you back kind of like to that core of who you are. And in order for you to kind of like step into this more authentic version of yourself, you have to figure out who you are outside of that fear and that trauma. So I kind of like to do it in that way. Like, you know, think about like a young child. How would you speak to them? Think about someone that you really, really care about. How would you speak to them? And it's like, why is that not as important as you being able to kind of like give that to yourself?
Right. Actually, I love that train of thought. And in fact, you know, if I were to think of how I'd be able to offer someone compassion, one of the best ways I like to do it is to get into like a little bit of a meditative space, because I feel like at that point, you're now slowing down your brain waves and you're allowing yourself to just simply kind of let go and release. And so you're not like, you know, high strung about your anxiety, but then you can actually see what happened. You can see where you were, and you can see how hurt you were in those moments. You could see the pain that was there, and you could see how the pain motivated you to do some things that maybe you weren't proud of, maybe you weren't happy about, maybe that may not have served you in the long run, but you can see the person that you were. And so I'm going to ask you if you're okay with it. One thing I'd like to do is to do a little bit of a meditation.
Absolutely. I love
meditation. And so before I jump into that though, is there anything else that you think you wanted to touch on with, you know, this aspect of where we are?
That was pretty much it. I think also another thing I'm going to kind of throw in there, but I think this also can help with the guided meditation that you're already doing. Like you do work. So anyway, a lot of like nervous system work. So like if you can find someone who's maybe like a somatic practitioner or anything like that, because they're able to kind of like get you regulated. So like all those ways that you were responding was out of fear and out of trauma, but sometimes the emotions can become like so gut-wrenching and like so overwhelming that like we're so dysregulated that like we don't know what to do. So I think also doing a lot of like body work, like qigong is really, really good for that too. And then also doing a lot of like nervous system work too. I think that's really important. So
yeah, you know, people don't actually know that most or all trauma is actually stored within the nervous system.
It's in your tissue.
Yeah. And it's within the synapses of your nervous system, because your brain and your nervous system is now used to firing in a certain way, and the way it's used to firing is in the way you were treated. And so, you know, your belief system is now basically imprinted as if it was tattooed within your cells. But the magic of it is that that's changeable. It's not that this is the only permanent way. The body is so neuroplastic, the nervous system is so neuroplastic that by inducing it with positivity, with different belief systems, with growth, with healing, you can actually rewire it now to have like a more constructive belief system, to create a better belief within the same, you know, nervous system, to say, my nervous system now tells me I'm lovable. I know now how to receive a hug. I know now how to like approach conversation and feel empathy and compassion for myself and the other person. I also know how to draw boundaries because I'm tuning into when I'm getting too tired, because I'm making myself too available, and so many other things, you know, that come from it.
Absolutely. Once you get that nervous system regulated, you're not going to fall back into old patterns and habits when you're triggered. You're going to know, you're going to have that capacity to deal with it. Even if you do end up in a relationship with another narcissist, that's not going to be a relationship that plays out. You know, you're going to see it, be able to regulate yourself and move on.
Exactly. Take the lessons, and this time you actually get to practice them, which is actually pretty magical, we think. Ah, man, this has been awesome, Imani. Thank you so much. Everybody on here, I would ask of you, if you really enjoyed this conversation, just say a little piece of gratitude towards Imani. Just throw in a little bit of a thank you, you know, a recognition for her. She's on my space on this platform, and I'm so grateful that she's on here. And as the host in this space, as the leader in this space, I would love for you all to just give her a little bit of gratitude and thanks for, you know, spending her time on here and being vulnerable with her story, giving us her like wisdom and guidance. I think you're doing something phenomenal, Imani, and I'm grateful that you reached out to me to be able to say like, hey, you know, like, is this something you'd like to do? I'm so grateful because you have so much to offer. And, you know, I would keep encouraging you always to stay true with what you're doing and to stick with the work that you do, because you are really changing people's lives. And so I'm grateful to you for being here and for doing this, like in this space. There's so many people who've seen value from just hearing your voice today. And it's marvelous. It really is.
Yeah. I'm in the business of healthy helping now. I turned my unhealthy helping into healthy helping. So I definitely appreciate you for even just allowing me. I treat my audience like my baby. So I'm very like particular around like who I bring in and stuff like that. So I even appreciate that you saw all of that in me. And your audience, they're absolutely wonderful. They've been like, you know, commenting and stuff the whole entire time. So I appreciate you for like giving me this moment to be on live and just talk about this with you, because so many of us deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, for those of you who asked, I'm actually going to get my team to cut this up and to create like, you know, conversations with Imani and I, and also to collect that recording at the end and to just make it a recording and a meditation. It'll probably go on YouTube. So two things that I want to say before I let Imani go is, one, thank you again, Imani, for everything you've offered here. And two, for those of you who really want to have more access to the inner work, we've created such an easy way for you to access it, you know, such an accessible way to access it, and that's called the Emotional Freedom Collective Community. The website is actually pinned right there, and you can join the community for just $1. And for 2 weeks at least, get to experience what it's about, to attend a live class, to be able to go through meditations that I'll take you through, breath work, get live journals, etc. It's just to be able to stay in touch with people within the collective of growing and healing. And you'll also get access, like I said, to like meditations and other things that we do in there. So it's a really beautiful and powerful space that we've created just to get the community growing through inner work, you know? So, and with that, I will say, thank you, Imani, again. Thank you, everybody who's on here. Thank you, Imani, and thank you, everybody else.